Well, last week we started a new series called Ordinary People, Extraordinary God. Ordinary People, Extraordinary God. And each week we've been diving into the lives of various biblical characters. And we're seeing how, despite their flaws, despite their limitations, shortcomings, challenges, they became instruments for God's grace and power. And if there's one thing you'll continue to learn and discover in this series as we look at the lives of these people, these ordinary people, is that God doesn't require perfection or status. What he's looking for is people, just like we sang, people who trust him. People who can say yes to him. People who are willing to say yes to him. Last week we explored the courageous actions of two midwives in Exodus 1 who defied Pharaoh's orders because from their perspective, following God and his heart was more important than trying to obey Pharaoh's orders and getting the baby boys murdered, because that was his plan. So they trusted God, even though Pharaoh declared and decreed and gave them instructions on what to do. These midwives trusted God. They risked their lives to protect life. And their reverence for God gave them the strength to resist injustice. It was their fear of God that not only set them free, but also set the nation of Israel free. Because of their decisions, God was orchestrating events to bring Moses, the future deliverer of Israel. Well, today we're going to look at another biblical account that deals with kings and kingdoms and the ongoing conflict between worldly power and the people of God. And this conflict isn't limited to ancient times or biblical times. It's a reality we still face today. Whether it involves empires or governments or societal pressures, there will always be a tension between the ways of the world and the ways of God. That's just how it is. And as followers of Christ, we are called to live faithfully, even when those tensions rise, trusting that God's kingdom will prevail. So let's take a look. I want you to go with me to 1 Kings chapter 18. We're going to look at the first 16 verses. 1 Kings 18, verses 1 through 16. And it reads like this. After a long time, in the third year, the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will rain on the land. So Elijah went to present himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe in Samaria, and Ahab had summoned Obadiah, his palace administrator, and Obadiah was a devout believer in the Lord. While Jezebel was killing off the Lord's prophets, Obadiah had taken 100 prophets and hidden them in 2 caves, 50 in each, and had supplied them with food and water. Ahab had said to Obadiah, go through the land to all the springs and valleys. Maybe we can find some grass to keep the horses and mules alive, so we will not have to kill any of our animals. So they divided the land they were to cover, Ahab going in one direction and Obadiah in another. And as Obadiah was walking along, Elijah met him. Obadiah recognized him, bowed down to the ground, and said, is it really you, my lord Elijah? Yes, he replied. Go tell your master, Elijah is here. What have I done wrong? Asked Obadiah, that you are handing your servant over to Ahab to be put to death. As surely as the Lord your God lives, there is not a nation or kingdom where my master has not sent someone to look for you. And whenever a nation or kingdom claimed you were not there, he made them swear they could not find you. But now you tell me to go to my master and say, Elijah is here? I don't know where the Spirit of the Lord may carry you when I leave you. If I go and tell Ahab and he doesn't find you, he will kill me. Yet I, your servant, have worshipped the Lord since my youth. Haven't you heard, my Lord, what I did while Jezebel was killing the prophets of the Lord? I hid 100 of the Lord's prophets in 2 caves, 50 in each, and supplied them with food and water. And now you tell me to go to my master and say, Elijah is here? He will kill me. Elijah said, as the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, I will surely present myself to Ahab today. So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. And it's a long passage, but it's a powerful one, and yet again another reminder that what God can accomplish through his people. And as I was preparing for this week, this passage reminded me of Brother Yun, who is a well-known Chinese Christian leader. In his book, The Heavenly Man, he shares his experiences as a house church leader in China. I read the book sometime last year, and it was so gripping, I couldn't put it down. Talk about a modern-day example of the tension between earthly powers and the people of God. Earthly powers that seek to restrict, to limit, to intimidate and control. And then on the other hand, God uses ordinary people all over the world. He raises them up to carry out his purposes. People that he raises up and empowers, who align their actions and decisions with God's purposes, plans, and they're obedient even in challenging circumstances. And Brother Yun is one of those people. If you ever get the chance, I recommend that you get the book, The Heavenly Man, and read it. It's truly a powerful book. Despite strict government restrictions on religious practices all over China, Yun remained committed to spreading the gospel. He was so committed. He was repeatedly arrested, repeatedly tortured, and imprisoned for his faith. Yet he continued to preach the gospel and lead others to Christ, even within the confines of prison walls. One of the most remarkable moments in his story happened when, despite being crippled from torture, he walked out of a maximum security prison at what many believe to be a miraculous escape. And throughout his trials, he demonstrated that no earthly authority could stop God's purposes. And I want you to know that if God has promised you something, he will deliver. No earthly power can stop him. I want you to know that. I want you to receive that word for your own life. God will accomplish his purposes no matter what. I love what Brother Yun said. It is not great men who change the world, but weak men in the hands of a great God. Ordinary people. Extraordinary God. Friends, this is a biblical truth. God often chooses the weak and seemingly insignificant to accomplish his greatest works. Just like these two men in this passage, two ordinary people, Elijah and Obadiah. And I understand most people, when they think of Elijah, they don't think ordinary. They think of someone truly great, someone so powerful, a great man of God, a great prophet, which he was. But his humanity is clearly displayed in the Bible. He struggled with the same emotions and limitations we ordinary people do. In James 5:17, it says, Elijah was a man just like us. But this morning, I want us to take a look at Obadiah and his role during King Ahab's reign. I want us to focus on the significance of his actions. And here's what's happening. Ahab is the king of Israel at this time. He reigned during the 9th century BC and is one of the most evil kings in the history of Israel. His reign was marked by idolatry, corruption, and immorality, and rebellion against God that led to significant consequences, both for himself and for the nation of Israel. And to make matters worse, he marries a Phoenician princess, Jezebel, who was all about Baal worship. And she aggressively tried to persuade her husband Ahab to erect an altar for Baal. And she got her wishes. Ahab built a temple for an altar for Baal, drawing the people further away from the worship of God. On top of that, with Ahab's support, she persecuted and killed many of God's prophets. However, this is where Obadiah comes in. Obadiah, who was a high-ranking official in Ahab's court, he did something. He took 100 of these prophets that they were going to kill, and he hid them in 2 caves. He placed 50 in each cave, and he provided them with food and water. Talk about courage. That is remarkable courage. He risked his life to do that because he feared God more than he feared the consequences of going against his king and queen's wishes. But because he did that, God protected him. God protected him. And by the way, we read, he also played a key role in facilitating a meeting between Ahab and Elijah. And he talks about it, and we read about that in this passage. He was so worried that if he were to go and tell King Ahab that Elijah was here, and then Ahab comes looking for Elijah, and Elijah was not there, guess who's going down? Obadiah. So he risks his life multiple times. Friends, can you guess the name of what the name Obadiah means? What his name suggests? Well, there are 2 meanings. Servant of Yahweh and worshiper of God. The name Obadiah means servant of Yahweh and a worshiper of God. What a fitting reflection of his character. An ordinary man, but he was a servant of God. And he was a worshiper of God. I find this to be truly remarkable when viewed in the context of Israel's history at the time. The nation, under the leadership of 2 evil people, Ahab and Jezebel, had largely abandoned their covenant with God. They didn't just ignore God's covenant, they actively rebelled against it. What does that remind you of? I think you all know. I think it mirrors a pattern we see today, everywhere. Not just in our nation, but all over the world, where we see many nations, including our own, have drifted away from biblical values that once anchored us in our faith. But I want you to know that it's not just passive drifting. we have been aggressively, intentionally replacing God with other idols. Intentional and aggressive drift that has taken place in our nation and all over the world. Israel replaced Yahweh with idols, and today we do the same, though our idols take many forms. It could be wealth, power, influence, cultural trends. Materialism and individualism dominate. We place personal freedom above spiritual freedom. Everybody wants to do their own thing. You can't say no because it's their right, it's their freedom to choose what they want to do. But the consequences are evident. It's so plain and clear. You see it. Total instability and disunity, hopelessness and spiritual emptiness. That's what happens when you drift away from God. When you drift from God. That's what happens when you go away from the foundation that once grounded you, that rooted you in your faith. And this can happen to anybody. Communities are fractured. Anxiety and depression are at record highs. Think about this. Despite all the technologies that claim to connect us, our children are increasingly disconnected. Despite all the avenues that exist, all the apps that exist, and phones in the hands of 11-year-olds today, not passing any judgment. And parents, don't look at your children. Our children have become increasingly disconnected and anxious, and they're struggling with identity and meaning. There's hopelessness and confusion and instability everywhere. But I want you to know that is not who God is. We don't serve a God who is confused or who brings confusion. God brings peace. He brings clarity. God is not a God of confusion. So when you look around and you're confused by what's happening, you need to know why that's happening. Because people have gone away from God. Paul reminds us in 1 Corinthians 14:33, for God is not a God of confusion, but of peace. And the chaos and instability around us are a clear picture or clear sign that we have drifted far from God. And when we distance ourselves from Him, we lose the peace and clarity that only He can provide. May I suggest that if you are confused, if you don't have a vision, if you're confused about what's happening in your life by certain situations, I want to urge you to seek Him to gain clarity. Because without Him in the picture, you're not going anywhere. You're not going to go anywhere without Him. So get a clear vision from God for your life, for your situations. The good news is that God's peace is always available to those who seek Him and those who return to His presence. Again, I just love that song, Trust in God. He's looking for people who are willing to say yes to Him, those who will trust Him at all costs. Even when situations are just overwhelming. Just like Obadiah. But what's the criteria? What's the criteria? When God looks at us, what is He thinking of? Like in terms of who is he going to pick? Who is he going to choose? We're talking about ordinary people, extraordinary God. There are a lot of ordinary people. There's nothing extraordinary about any one of us here. We're all ordinary. But what's his criteria? When he looks at us, what makes him go, he will say yes to me. She will pull through. He's going to honor me. She's going to remain faithful to me. What's his criteria? Because again, if God is in the business of using ordinary people, what's his criteria? Out of so many ordinary people, whom does he select and choose? Well, the answer is simple. He's looking for a servant and a worshiper, like Obadiah. He's looking for a servant and a worshiper. Those who seek him and those who serve him. By serving people. How do you serve God? By serving people. So a lot of ordinary people. But then his criteria, when he looks at us, he goes, that's my servant. Here's one who truly worships me. His heart is aligned with me. He's in tune with me. Obadiah wasn't a prophet or king. He was an ordinary man. Yes, he had a position in Ahab's court, but he was an ordinary man working in a broken system, working or serving under a corrupt king. Yet his heart remained faithful to God, and God saw him. He took notice. Out of all the people, God selected Obadiah, a servant and a worshiper. And Obadiah's faithfulness played a key, crucial role in protecting God's people, while Jezebel was on a violent mission, on a killing spree, killing the prophets of God, and establish Baal worship. Obadiah quietly defied her and his king's orders. He hid 100 prophets in 2 caves. Talk about risking your life. Because for him, the consequences were greater if he didn't do what God wanted him to do. His actions demonstrate that even in the most hostile environments, God's people can remain faithful and take bold steps to protect his purposes. Friends, let me remind you once again, God isn't looking for perfect people. He's not. He's not looking for people that have it all put together. People, status and ranks and skill set and all things that are there. He's looking for ordinary people. Are you a servant? Are you a worshiper? Then he wants to use you. Are you faithful? 2 Chronicles 16:9. You don't have to go there, but let me read this for you. The eyes of the Lord search the whole earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him. Think about that. That God is searching. All over the world, God is searching for people whose hearts are committed to him. Faithfulness and a heart of worship are what God desires as he empowers and strengthens them. You know why God is not looking for people with a certain skill set, or not that he can't use people with whatever they've got, but the reason why God looks for ordinary people who are committed to him is because he wants to equip them and strengthen them. Because they're ordinary. Everything about them is so ordinary. Let me ask you, who are you? Who are you? Who are we as a church? Are you a servant of God? Are you a worshiper of God? Are you fully devoted to him? Or are you partially committed to him? There are a lot of Christians walking around who are partially committed to him. They're not fully committed. They're partially committed. 1 foot in the world and 1 foot in God's kingdom. Partially committed. It's easy to claim faith, but God calls us to wholehearted devotion. Wholehearted devotion. Half-hearted faith leads to instability. That is what I'm trying to tell you. Half-hearted faith leads to instability. As Jesus said, no one can serve two masters. Half-hearted faith is not going to work if you want to be used by God. We live in such a non-commitment culture, and that seeps into the church. But the people in the church are living the same way people on the outside are living. Partial commitment. There's some level of commitment, not fully committed, not fully devoted, because it's asking a lot. Folks, do you know why Ahab ended up where he was spiritually? Because he was half-hearted. That's why. He had half-hearted faith. He tried to serve both God and Baal. That's what he tried to do. And ultimately, compromise led him further from God. It's what happens when we compromise with God. We drift away, far away, and that's what's happening all around us. That's what has happened in our beautiful nation. A slow drift, but then now they've become far removed from God's plans and purposes for their lives. Total instability, spiritual emptiness, confusion, depression, anxiety, isolation. I mean, you can go on and on and on. There is an identity crisis. People don't know who they are anymore. Later in this passage, there's a famous showdown on Mount Carmel, and most of you, I'm sure, are familiar. Showdown between the prophets of Baal and Elijah. And at one point, Elijah confronts the people. I'm going to read this verse to you, okay? Elijah confronts the people, these prophets of Baal, and this is what he says. How long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him. And then you know what it says next? Yet the people stood silent, unwilling to fully commit to God. Those are not my words. Verse 21. Elijah goes, I'm going to give you one more opportunity. One final call to repent. Here's your opportunity. Come to Yahweh. Pledge your allegiance to Yahweh. One final opportunity. What are you going to do? They stood in silence because they couldn't fully commit to him. Half-hearted faith. That's what happened to Ahab, and that's what happened to these prophets who were once they were prophets of Yahweh, became prophets of Baal, and that's what happened to majority of people in Israel. Half-hearted faith. unwilling to fully commit to God. Sadly, this is the condition many among us, friends. Let us evaluate our own hearts. Are we fully devoted to God, or are we trying to live with one foot in the world and one in faith? True worship, if you want to be a true worshiper, it requires absolute surrender. Complete surrender. You cannot worship God if you cannot surrender to Him. You can read what's up on the screen. You can sing along. That's fine. But if you want to worship God the way He must be worshiped, because God is looking for who? True worshipers. Worship in spirit and truth. You cannot be a worshiper unless and until you fully commit, devote your life to Him. Not with hesitation or divided loyalties. So are you someone who feels torn between worldly desires and the truth of God? If so, be careful, because staying in that tension too long will eventually lead you to choose rebellion over repentance. And again, that's what has happened in our nation. People they've said yes to rebellion. Yes to rebellion instead of repenting and giving their hearts and minds to God. That's the path Ahab followed, and we've seen where it led him. Now you might say, you don't understand. You don't understand, Pastor. I'm on a journey. I'm on a journey like everyone. You can't judge me. You can't judge me about where I am. I'm on a spiritual journey. You can't say that. Well, I'm not judging you. Only God is a true judge. But I'm going to say it like it is. And I'm going to ask you difficult questions. And the question I want to ask you is, how long more are you going to stay like this? How long more are you going to journey in this fashion, in this manner? How long will you walk this road of mediocrity? How long will you keep your faith lukewarm until your life is over? Or are you willing to say, enough is enough? Are you willing to say, I'm going to take a stand for God? I'm going to become a devoted follower of Him. Friends, I want you to know that He wants to use you. But you must become a servant first. You must become a worshiper. How does faith grow? If you want to be a fully devoted Christian, then you have to grow in your faith. It's a daily walk. Daily walk. And how does faith grow? Faith grows from spending time in God's presence, in prayer and in His Word. Without that connection, it's easy to be overcome by fear and pressures of the world. But when we stay close to God, we develop the strength to step up even when it feels uncomfortable or risky. That's what Obadiah did. He was a servant and he was a worship. And God equipped him. He strengthened him, empowered him to stay the course, to take these risks, enormous risks. So I want you to know, whether it's a palace or a workplace, supermarket or at home or in your neighborhood, God can use you if you are willing to serve and worship Him faithfully. So no longer can you blame your ungodly environment for your actions. You cannot blame your ungodly environment for your faith. The choices you make, the convictions you hold, the faith you live out are ultimately your responsibility. Your responsibility. Your environment might be difficult or hostile to your beliefs, but it doesn't determine your relationship with God. You do. You do. You are responsible. Just like Obadiah, who remained faithful while serving under Ahab and Jezebel. So Obadiah served God's people even though he worked in a faithless environment. God has placed us here in this city, in this region, in New England, for a purpose. And I'm telling you, He's scanning. He's scanning, if you will. He's searching, and He's looking for people who are committed to Him. Who's going to serve me? Who's going to worship me? Because He knows that when it really counts, it's those people that will pull through. It's those people that will take risks. It's those people that God will use to orchestrate events behind the scenes to fulfill His plan and purposes.